So this is going to be a little bit of a different type of video than what I normally do. And this is going to be about maybe more so some of my personal philosophies and some personal stories. And so all the research which I do, it's really what drives me, my own personal motivation is I'm interested in not really the big picture, like, is this a computer simulation? Were we created by Sumerian gods and stuff like that? That's not really what I'm interested in. Though, those are valid sort of questions to ponder. Mine are always a little one level below that. I'm interested in what it is to be human. How do we work? What is the inner world? What is the outer world? What is trickery? What is real? How do you work with it? How do they relate? Those sort of things. And so the story which I want to tell you today is one which I always think is a really, really interesting example of kind of like life's journey and how the inner world is relative. And I've been thinking about this for the past couple days about how I want to tell this story, how I want to present it. And from my perspective, it was mostly like, me just telling a personal story. And not so much about like weird synchronicities or anything like that, but, through the process of putting this together, sure enough, weird synchronicity happened. And I always like I see synchronicities the way how I interpret them is it is an indication of the inner world, what you're thinking, you're feeling, your inner experience, and that being synced up or tightly aligned with the outer world. And so I thought it was just kind of funny, and it's indicative that maybe now's the time to tell the story. So this story begins I don't know, about 10 years ago when I lived in this neighborhood right outside of Lancaster City. I was living right about here in this neighborhood, which is known as School Lane. And it's a fantastic neighborhood, like homes built in the 50s, 60s, mature trees, just very, very, very livable. And home life has always been important to me, and just like where I live in the neighborhood and that sort of stuff. And so I loved living here. And for the most part, the neighborhood was very, very well established. A lot of the people who lived there were 70 years old or maybe been living there for 50 years, a long time. And a quarter of the population there were newcomers, such as myself. And so whenever someone new would come in, like, all of the young folks would kind of be aware of that and seek each other out, I suppose. And I would be one of those people. So I was living, this is where my house was, like right about here. And after a couple years, this guy, Chris, he moves in right here. Chris was an interesting guy. I was probably in my mid-30s at the time. And Chris was maybe 10 years older than I was. And he was an anesthesiologist. And as far as like the American dream goes, like you don't really get much better than being an anesthesiologist. We love doctors here in this culture, and then within the whole realm of being in the medical profession, arguably, like, the anesthesiologist is the best of that world, in terms of their compensation and let's say the amount of and type of work which they do. So Chris, on a certain level, had it made. He was in a really nice position in life, but there was something that was missing. I don't know Chris that well, but I knew him well enough. And the thing that was missing with him drove him to Buddhism. And, I know a little bit about Buddhism. I've been to some things and have done some research, but I'm definitely not an expert. But Chris was, and he really put a lot of his energy and devoted the latter part of his life towards his studies, and eventually became an ordained Buddhist priest. And I always thought that was interesting. I thought that was, just in terms of whenever I see people and they veer off the established path, particularly when the established path has, at least on the surface, has served them well. And so I thought that was kind of cool. And I also thought it was kind of cool just how he was demonstrating, an alignment between what was valuable to him inside and then making his outer world become in alignment with that. And he was withdrawing from his medical profession and really wanted to devote his life towards teaching and being I guess a leader within the local Buddhist community. So around the same time which I met Chris, this other guy moves in. And he moves in right here. This guy is, or was, about 10 years younger than me. If I were to guess, he was probably in his late 20s. And his name, I think it was Jigme. I never was certain what his name was because he would say it and I needed to see it to really know what it was. So Jigme was, he was from Tibet. He was born in Tibet, and he spent his first 20 years of his life in Tibet. And he was not just a regular Tibetan citizen. He was identified early in his life, like as a newborn, even possibly. I'm not certain. But he was identified, however these things were done, as a reincarnated lama from like a very significant lama in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And he was given to a local monastery from his parents, and he was raised in this monastery with this knowing that he was this reincarnated lama. And he was to have a life at this particular time, doing whatever this reincarnated lama was supposed to do. And apparently this is, I don't know how common stuff like this happens, but it's common enough that when I was doing a little bit of research prior to making this recording, I came across this story here about a 9-year-old boy in Minneapolis who was identified as a reincarnation of a Buddhist Lama as well. And in this article, it just kind of goes and says that he was kind of walking in both worlds. He was still being raised in his community in Minnesota, but as he was maturing, he was going to spend time in the Himalayas and learn whatever it is that secret teachings and techniques, which I guess you would teach a reincarnated Lama. But Jigme, he also he had this experience himself, and he had it even more intensely than this young man here because he lived and was raised his entire time, his entire developmental period of his life by I guess priests who had an understanding of who this child would become. Now, my personal opinion is I don't know anything about reincarnation. Like, I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it's factual or not, but I'm certainly open to it. And I found that fascinating about Jigbe's experience because at the time I had young children, and I was very aware of how culture, how experiences in the first 7 years of life really shape the individual. The whole sort of like nature nurture sort of understanding of when a human being is being formed. And so I found Jigme both like he was interesting as a person, but I also looked at him from this other perspective. I was I was studying him. I was just noticing just the way he was, and it was very, very interesting the way he handled himself and just his openness. It was fascinating. I had another friend at the time in the same area, Jason. Jason's one of my favorite people, and who I've ever had the pleasure to meet. And Jason was fascinating in the fact that he was. I'll tell this little story about Jason before we go back to Jigme. But Jason he was born and raised in Long Island, and he was a third generation, or his father and his grandfather were professional New York City firefighters, and he kind of grew up in that culture and tradition, and that didn't really fit Jason. Jason, he eventually, he got his master's degree in English literature. He spent time living in a monastery, just kind of like not really what you would think the son of a New York City firefighter, what his life would look like. And then Jason one day, I think probably in his mid-20s, probably late 20s, Saturn return sort of stuff. He looks himself in the mirror and he's like, who am I kidding? I'm a friggin' firefighter. And he quit his teaching job and enrolled in the, I don't know, the firefighter program or for New York City. And, now he's a captain in New York City firefight. He's a captain in the fire department. Real interesting guy. But what Jason said to me once, and this always stuck with me, I think this was even before I met Jigme. He said, Jason, as a teenager, he used to work as an orderly in a state hospital for, the mentally disturbed. He was around, if you could imagine what that must be like. That experience being around, really disturbed sort of people, like from all extremes, some of them like really violent, some of them just like really internalized. But one of the things Jason said to me, which always stuck with me, was that there's very, very little difference from an enlightened Buddhist practitioner. And remember, he spent some time living in a monastery, to someone who is, completely mentally incapacitated. He was like, their openness is so similar, and I always thought that was funny. And I kind of thought about that when I met Jigme, and just kind of like the way he was. It was so pure and so natural, just in terms of how he approached life. But the story, which I really want to get to, has to do with what Jigme told me about his journey. So he spent his first 18 years being raised to be this, pillar within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And at 18, he came to the realization, very, very similar to Jason, which is like, who am I kidding? I'm Jigme. I'm not a reincarnated Lama. And I asked him about this. I was like, was that a hard realization? He was like, yes, it was a hard realization, because he knew how there was a lot of responsibility which was placed upon his shoulders by all of these people who raised him to be a certain way. And one day he had to kind of like just face up to what he knew as his inner truth. And he went to his primary teacher, and he told his teacher, he's like, I'm Jigme. I'm not this reincarnated guy. And I don't want to I don't want to live in a monastery. I want to live a different life. I want to live a regular life. In fact, I want to move to the United States, and I want to be a baker. And so sure enough, Jigme goes and he moves to the United States, and I believe he moved to Boston. And when he was in Boston, he met a graduate student, and they fell in love, and they got married, and then they moved to Lancaster, where I believe his wife was a professor. But the point of this story was this fascination I had with life, because we have, living right here, we had Chris, who had everything that you would want on this kind of like story of what we're being told, of like, what life is all about, what the American dream is all about. And he walked away from it because he wanted to be this Buddhist priest. And then just 2 blocks away from where Chris was Jigme. And here was this guy who was identified as a child to be the reincarnated Lama and to live his life in that trajectory. And he was like, no, I don't want that. What I want to do is move to America and live the American dream and open up a bakery. And so that to me was so, I mean, it just tickled me. It didn't give me an answer other than the fact that life is an internal journey. Life is our internal journey, and it is the integrity of living our external life in alignment with what we feel in our inner world. And so I was thinking about all of this and how I wanted to position this story and just kind of doing a little bit of research and trying to remember people's names and that sort of stuff. And this was literally just yesterday. Today's March 8th. And as I was doing this, I was sitting in a coffee shop, and that's where I like to do a lot of my work and research. And I get this notification pops up on my computer, and it's from an Instagram app, and it's saying, you've got a new follower. And as I was kind of working in my mind what this story would be, I kept on coming across the phrase Buddhist priest, and I was laughing at that because I was thinking about, there used to be a metal band from, I guess it was the 80s, Judas Priest. And I was like, how much, that sounded like it, and just how that was a play on words. And I was thinking a lot about it. And sure enough, as I'm going through all of these types of thoughts and in preparation for this notification comes by. And what is the name of the guy who it was a notification that said I had a new follower. And the notification, the name of the follower happens to be Buddhist Priest. You can see this happened. Do I have a date here? It's Saturday is when it happened. Today's Sunday. So this happened yesterday. And Buddhist Priest starts following me as I'm going through all this. So I send the guy a message and I tell him all about the synchronicity of it. And so even when you're kind of in your own thoughts, and that's where I was. I'm thinking about on a practical level, how am I going to tell this story and just how I'm going to structure it. There's this wink. This wink from life, whatever life is, whatever this environment is that we're living in, is when you really start to synchronize and you really start to see your life, your internal life in alignment with this external life. There are all of these kind of clues all around you, all of these signs, which are just kind of to me, just a sign that's saying, yeah, you're on the right path, I suppose. So this is where I'm going to wrap up this portion of this talk, and I'm going to continue on with a second part, and this is just for the subscribers on Subscribestar. So if you're interested and you're watching this on YouTube, consider subscribing. This is Mike, and thank you for your attention.